Well, hey everyone. I want to welcome you into another exciting episode of the Easter Pod. This is episode 3. We're already on our third episode, which is very exciting and hard to believe. I'm going to try and keep today's intro a little bit shorter so that we can get to our guest, because he and I had a really fun conversation that I think a lot of you are going to really enjoy. And our guest today is, in fact, one half of the Film and Whiskey podcast, Bob Book. And Bob hosts the Film and Whiskey podcast alongside another friend of the Easter Pod, Brad G. And on the Film and Whiskey podcast, Bob and Brad have many fun and in-depth conversations about movies and whiskey, and they get to talk to a lot of great guests. And so I was very excited to get to have Bob on the show today. And like I said, I think you're really going to enjoy our conversation. Before we get into my conversation with Bob, I just want to thank you again for listening. If you've been listening to our first couple episodes and you're liking what you hear, definitely be sure to tell a friend, and then your friend will tell two friends, and then they'll tell two friends, and then they'll tell two friends, and the pyramid scheme for the Easter Pod will be complete. And before you know it, everyone will be listening to the Easter Pod. In all seriousness, if you want to follow the Easter Pod and engage with us on social media, you can find us on Facebook, The Easter Pod, and on Twitter and Instagram at The Easter Pod. And if you're listening to the show, that means you likely found us on either iTunes or Spotify or Google. We're on all the major podcast platforms, so definitely be sure to keep checking us out and follow us on social media. As I mentioned, I had a great conversation with Bob on this episode. We covered a lot of topics like this year's Oscars. Bob gives his take on that, and we discuss the Oscars a little bit. We talk about some of Bob's favorite movies that they've covered on the podcast. Bob even gives some podcasting tips and shares his expertise on all things whiskey related and so much more. It was a really fun conversation, and I'm really glad that we got to have it. So if you listen to our second ever episode with my wonderful and awesome wife, Megan, you know that in that episode's intro, we talked about trying to have some fun and introduce some new segments to the Easter Pod. One of the segments that I want to bring back this week was called Easter Eggs. For this week's Easter egg, the little hidden fact about the episode is something that Bob and I chatted about a little bit, and it's how Bob was one of the huge inspirations for me early on in starting the Easter Pod. He was somebody that gave me a lot of feedback and was very encouraging. He and I met up recently when I was in Ohio at the Northside Speakeasy in Akron, which is a place you should definitely check out if you're ever in Akron, Ohio. And over some cocktails, he let me ask him a million questions about podcasting and really took the time to challenge me to stop hesitating and holding off on starting the Easter Pod and just go for it. And I really appreciated that. So shout out to Bob for all his help getting the Easter Pod started. Unfortunately, we won't be taking a trip to Easter Island this week. I know, you're disappointed, but never fear, because we have a brand new segment that I want to try out. And before I intro it, I don't want to be too sacrilegious with the wordplay on my last name of Easter Day, but I do want to have some fun early on in doing this podcast. And the goal is to, as we get different guests on, talk about more serious stuff in addition to all of the music and sports and pop culture things that I like to cover. But this new segment is going to be another fun one, and it's called the Easter Basket. And the Easter Basket is a recommendation that's small enough to fit in a basket, perhaps one that you would receive on the holiday of Easter, but it's big enough to change your whole life, which is obviously ridiculous and won't change your whole life, but who knows? It might. You never know. Some things that I might recommend could be life-changing. The only way to find out is to look inside our Easter basket. So let's see what we have in the Easter basket this week. All right, I'm ruffling around. Let's see, going through the Easter basket. Oh, what's that? Oh, we got a big chocolate bunny. That's awesome. I love chocolate bunnies. Who doesn't love a chocolate bunny? All right, let's keep looking here. Oh, look at that. More candy. And wouldn't you know, it's the classic Easter candy that everybody loves. It's Peeps. Shout out to Peeps Candy for being in this week's Easter basket. All right, still looking here. And we got some fake green straw, which is a necessary component of every Easter basket, but doesn't necessarily help us out right now. And it's the last thing in the Easter basket. And wouldn't you know it, it's the exact thing I wanted to recommend. It's an album that I really love that I've been listening to on a repeat a lot recently, even though it came out in May of 2019. And that album is Vampire Weekend. It's their album Father of the Bride. So it's not the 1991 film starring Steve Martin, which incidentally, I do love that movie, Father of the Bride. But it's actually Vampire Weekend's fourth studio album. And some of my favorite tracks on the album are Hold You Now, which is one of two tracks, one of a few tracks they have that is a duet with Danielle Haim, which I hope I pronounced the last name correctly because I love that band. But Hold You Now is one of the tracks I love. The other duet is Married in a Gold Rush. And the one I've really been enjoying lately is called Harmony Hall. And they have another great one called This Life. And really, the whole album is wonderful from start to finish. And I recommend listening to it that way from start to finish. So, again, this week's Easter basket, Vampire Weekend, Father of the Bride. Definitely check it out. All right. Well, I hope you're enjoying these really cheesy segments because I'm a very cheesy guy. So I love dad jokes and wordplay, and I hope you love dad jokes and wordplay as much as I. Hey, I kind of rhymed right there. I and guy. Wouldn't you know it? I could be a poet. All right, I better calm down. I had, as I do before every recording session, just a lot of coffee today. So I'll go ahead and just take it down a couple notches. All right, we're taking it down. And we're going to get into our conversation coming up with Bob Book. And I want to thank you again for listening. And before we chat with Bob, I want to remind you to check out Film and Whiskey, the Film and Whiskey podcast on Facebook, Film and Whiskey Podcast, Instagram, Twitter, @Film Whiskey. Go ahead and be sure to listen to them on iTunes and Spotify and all the places where you can get podcasts. Oh, and before I forget, for both the Film and Whiskey podcast and the Easter Pod, be sure to leave a rating for each podcast, 5 stars, obviously. Go ahead and leave a review for each podcast, and be sure to subscribe to both of our podcasts so that you don't miss out on all the fun. Without further ado, my conversation with Bob Book. Well, I am very excited to have joining me on the Easter Pod today a very good friend and host of the Film and Whiskey podcast, Bob Book. Bob is a co-host of the Film and Whiskey podcast along our mutual friend, Brad G. And on the Film and Whiskey podcast, they have reviewed 50 films to date, and they have reviewed more than 50 whiskeys. They have about 75 total episodes in their catalog, which you should absolutely check out if you're not already a listener. And recently, congratulations is in order for Bob and for Brad, because recently the Film and Whiskey podcast turned 1 year old. And another congratulations is in order for Bob, because he recently welcomed another child into the world. He is a father yet again for the second time. And I'm just so excited to have him on the show today. Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Corey. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, of course. It's my pleasure. It makes me think of a quick story of, I believe it was the spring or summer of 2018, shortly before I moved to the Charlotte area away from Ohio, and you and I were seeing a screening of the movie Annihilation, and we were sitting there talking about how each of us had a desire to have a creative outlet like a podcast to talk about things like movies and other stuff that we really enjoyed in pop culture and sports and whatnot. And so it's very surreal to me today to be sitting here 2 years later, each of us having our own podcast, talking to each other in this format. How does it feel to you that the Film and Whiskey podcast is 1 year old now?
Honestly, it's kind of surreal. It seems in a lot of ways like it's been longer than a year because we've done so many episodes. I think part of our game plan at the forefront of it was like, we need to put out as much content as we can in the first year just to get people used to hearing us and to try to kind of build that catalog of episodes so that people, when they're scrolling through Spotify or Apple Podcasts, they see that we've done, more than 5 episodes. Honestly, for us, the thing was like, we need to be consistent with how often we release episodes. And so we're really diligent about putting something out every week, at least 1 episode a week. For over the course of the year, like you said, we've done 75 episodes, and it's kind of crazy to look back and think that it's only been a year and we have this much content that we've put out. So it's been a ton of hard work, but we're still having fun with it.
Yeah, that's really impressive to me. And you've been somebody that's been instrumental in helping me to get this podcast started, for which I have to profusely thank you. But just to see the volume and consistency of you doing this podcast and the quality of the podcast itself has been very impressive, because neither you or I are getting paid to do this at the moment. And I know for myself, I'm just happy if I can get out one episode a week. So to see what you guys have done is just really impressive. How did the Film and Whiskey podcast get started?
Yeah, the podcast is kind of the result of a lot of different threads that we had going. Brad and I both went to the same grad school in Kentucky. And so, we've been friends since college. We went to the same grad school. And while we were there, the idea of podcasting kind of came up. I think podcasting had really started to boom. I'd been wanting to get into podcasting for a couple of years, and so I tried a couple different things. I basically at one point produced like what I thought would be a good test podcast where I just talked about Cleveland sports for an hour, and like I think 25 people downloaded it, and I found out that like not many people enjoyed it. And so I started to think about, all right, listen, if I want to get into podcasting and I want this to be for real, what's something that I'm passionate about? What's something that I'm really knowledgeable about? And what's the best way to present it? And so for me, that was movies. I've always been a huge movie nerd. But I think at the same time, I recognized I can't have a podcast where I just babble about stuff for an hour and share trivia with people. It's going to get really boring really fast. And I think it's going to make me sound really pretentious. And so I approached Brad and said, listen, man, I really respect how we get into these deep discussions about films. I know that you haven't seen a lot of classic movies. What would you say to doing a podcast with me where we kind of work through a list of classic movies and you give your feedback on them, most of them that you're seeing for the first time? I'm there to kind of be, the color commentator and fill things in a little bit and maybe help move the conversation along a little bit. And so we really struck up this dynamic where it works because I bring a little bit more of the background information. Brad brings his really honest feedback on seeing some of these movies for the first time. And because of that, I think it gives our listeners a really easy avenue into approaching some of these movies. A lot of times people will recommend movies to you, and if you don't really have a base or something in common with that person, it's hard to take a recommendation. And so I think Brad really has been a great sort of stand-in for the audience, because a lot of people that listen to our podcast have never seen these movies either. And based on Brad's recommendation or Brad's reaction, I think a lot of our listeners have been really impressed with that, and they've also kind of expanded the movies that they've seen as a result.
Yeah, that's one of the dynamics that I find really enjoyable and interesting about the show. Is I was binging a few of your episodes in preparation for our chat today, and I really love how it's evolved from episode 1 to now. Like you were mentioning, the dynamic between you and Brad, and a lot of the movies that you review on the podcast are movies that I haven't seen myself, and I consider myself to be a movie buff of sorts, not to the level of someone like yourself or others, but it's cool to be able to hear about those movies through the lens of someone maybe like a Brad that hasn't seen them and can provide that perspective. I find myself connecting with that. And so like you were saying, I feel like you both bring a really good balance to each other in that regard of being yourself that has maybe more historical or in-depth knowledge on most of these movies, and then someone like Brad maybe just seeing them for the first time or chatting about them. And you guys have struck up a really good balance, and it's just really fun to listen to. Can you describe a typical episode of the Film and Whiskey podcast?
Yeah, so what we do is we release a regular episode every Monday. And on those episodes, we've picked a movie. We're working from a list of about 150 movies, and we try to keep the list pretty varied. So it's not just all old movies. It's not black and white movies. We'll jump from this past week. We recorded One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a classic movie from the 70s. And then the week before that, I think we did Django Unchained and Eternal Sunshine. So we're really trying to get a broad base of movies that we could consider quote unquote classics. And so Brad and I will kind of introduce the movie. We'll talk about whether or not Brad's seen it before. He gives his sort of initial impressions of the movie. And we do this really fun segment where we call it Brad Explains, where he breaks down the plot of the movie. And it's really funny, especially if he's only seeing it for the first time, because a lot of times his anger or his opinions at the movie kind of bleed into Brad Explains. We'll talk about, what we thought of the direction and the acting and everything like that. And then right in the middle of the episode, we take a break and we try a new glass of whiskey. We try a new whiskey on every episode, and we try to vary those ones up as well. We'll do bourbons, scotches, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, and we break down some things in the whiskey. We give it a score out of 50, things we like, things we dislike. We'll talk about whiskey for 10, 15 minutes, and then we go back into kind of our closing arguments on the movie. We'll break down what we see as the deeper themes. We'll give a little bit of analysis, and then we actually score the movie at the end of the episode as well out of 10. So, it's a review episode. The structure is that we're reviewing whiskey and we're reviewing the movie. And I think it's really fun because, like you said, I'm not like a professional movie critic. I'm just a regular guy. And so it's two regular guys that are trying a whiskey for the first time and giving their initial impressions. And a lot of times, at least one of us is watching a movie for the first time and giving his initial impression about that as well. So it's really unfiltered. It's not like there's a lot of like critical baggage that we're bringing into the podcast with us. We really are just giving our impressions as two guys who, are just out of grad school, can't afford hugely expensive bottles of whiskey. So we factor in things like value and then also our opinions on some of these movies that we're told are classics and that we should love. So a lot of times we'll come out with scores on movies or whiskey that are higher or lower than people would expect. And I think it makes for a really fun podcast, and it's one that you can't really predict.
When you talk about scoring whiskeys and scoring films, what is your rubric per se? What are your metrics for scoring a whiskey or scoring a film?
Yeah, that's definitely been like a point of trial and error. So when we first started, I'll talk about the whiskey first. When we first started the podcast, we were scoring whiskeys out of 40. And what we do is we give a score 1 to 10 on 4 different categories. The first one is the nose. So like when you pour out your whiskey and you start to smell it and you start to pick out some of the things that the aromas that are coming out of your glass, especially like in bourbons, you usually get a lot of caramel scents, a lot of vanilla. Does it smell really harsh? Does it smell like you're sniffing a bottle of rubbing alcohol? Like all those things go into that score. And so from nose, we go into taste. Obviously, like what does it remind you of? What sort of things that you would find in your kitchen is it reminiscent of? Do you taste fruit on it? Things like that. The third thing is finish. So like after you swallow, what kind of taste does it leave in your mouth? Is it really bitter? Is it pleasant? And then the fourth thing was overall balance, which is all of those things put together. If one of those elements stood out above or below the others, it would really mess up the balance score. So initially we were scoring out of 40, but we added a fifth category of value, because I think a lot of times you get a whiskey that's pretty good, but then if someone tells you I only paid $15 for this bottle of whiskey, it kind of like amplifies everything that you enjoyed about it, because whiskey can be overpriced. Whiskey can be really expensive. Brad and I have actually had a few whiskeys that we really enjoyed, and then we found out the bottle cost $100, and it's like, I really enjoyed this whiskey, but I would never pay $100 for it. And I think it kind of keeps us honest, and it keeps us giving really open feedback about where we think the market is, because I think in a lot of cases, people see an expensive whiskey and they think that it's going to be better just because it's on a higher shelf. And what we're out to prove is that, no, you can get a good whiskey at any price. And in a lot of cases, I'd rather recommend that you buy 3 bottles of the $20 whiskey than 1 bottle of the $60 whiskey.
Yeah, that's very true. I know in my own whiskey and bourbon purchasing experiences that it's not always the case that high price and high quality correlate. And what I mean by that is not that I'm out there buying expensive bottles of whiskey, because much like you guys, who can afford $75, $100 bottles and up on a regular basis, but more to what you were saying, that you can get really great whiskeys and bourbons for $30-$40, and just being able to stock up on those and having a podcast like yours that reviews such a wide variety can really help in making some of those purchase decisions. And I've learned a lot through listening to your podcast about the different whiskeys that are out there, and just some of the things to taste for and look for. I remember working for Starbucks and doing coffee tastings with trainees as a barista trainer, and learning how to identify the flavor notes and the smells and what foods to pair it with. So I would imagine that tasting whiskeys is similar and reviewing them is similar in everything you described of the things that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that one of the things that we really struggled with at the beginning was the fact that none of us are trained in this. It's not like we were sommeliers or something, like before we started drinking whiskey. So at first, you really only are able to identify a couple things in a whiskey, like, oh, this smells sweet. This smells like caramel. This smells like vanilla. And then, the more you drink, the more you kind of start to think back to, like, what's in my kitchen? What does it smell like when I smell an apple pie that's baking? You start to get notes of apple and yeast and cinnamon. And it all sounds like really, really stuffy, but I think it's because in a lot of cases, like, we just don't require ourselves to think about the things that we eat or the things that we drink. And so it's been really cool for me and Brad to kind of enter into this world of tasting and nosing whiskey, but to try to do it in a way that's really approachable, to try to get our audience to kind of come along with us and say, all right, like, put your nose in this glass. Tell me if you smell banana in there. Everybody knows what a banana smells like. And when you start to pick up on notes like that, you're like, oh man. And it kind of opens up these areas in your mouth too, where now that you're tasting the whiskey, you're like, oh, I can kind of taste that note of banana. It's really, really interesting. And it's been kind of fun to watch our audience kind of grow along with us in this journey. Because like I said, we weren't professionals at this at all. And so we're learning more how to better communicate, like what we're picking up in the glass. And I think we're getting really good feedback from our listeners as well as they're trying these whiskeys. And then they're reporting back to us like, yeah, I definitely picked up that note of X, Y, and Z. So it's been really fun.
You and Brad have even had the opportunity to do some remote taste tests, to travel a little bit, conduct some really great interviews with different distilleries and people that are in the whiskey industry. I believe last summer you even went to Kentucky to record some stuff. What's it been like to do that and to connect with more folks in the whiskey industry through this podcast?
Honestly, I think that's where we've seen like our biggest growth as a podcast. The whiskey community on social media and just as a listener base has been incredible, and they're so welcoming. And I think there's a bunch of whiskey podcasts out there, and a lot of people that do those podcasts are way more knowledgeable about whiskey than us. But I think what's so great is that they're really welcoming to us because we're upfront about the fact that we're novices. We're learning alongside everybody else that's listening to our podcast. And what I've really been so impressed with is the distillery community in Kentucky. I think that you would think that because a lot of them are owned by these larger corporations that it would be really hard to approach them. And what we found is that that's not the case at all. Honestly, I just started emailing distilleries and saying, hey, we're this new podcast. We'd really love to come do an interview with your CEO, talk about whiskey. And the way we first approached it was we had this kind of hybrid bonus episode thing that we did called My Favorite Movie, where we would go talk to the CEO and they'd really get a chance to plug their products, to talk about, the spirit or the ethos of their company. And then we would just segue right into talking about, hey, tell us what your favorite movie is. And we would sit down over a glass of whiskey with these CEOs and they would just open up. Like we had one guy talk about how his favorite movie was The Big Lebowski. And it's such a fun environment because it gets these guys kind of out of the mindset of having to talk about their selling points all the time and only focus on numbers and data and what's going on in their business. And we're just talking to them like human beings and saying, hey, just like all of us, you have a favorite movie. Tell us what yours is. And it actually really ends up being a great window into these guys' personalities. You would never expect that the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company would be talking about The Big Lebowski, but here we are. And I think it makes for really great audio because it makes these guys approachable. They seem really, really laid back. And then when we segue into talking about, their product, it seems more authentic. It seems less like they're trying to sell you something. So we've really enjoyed it. We've gotten some great distillery tours out of the whole process. We've gotten to pick up a couple bottles of whiskey that we otherwise never would have. So we really loved that trip to Kentucky. We're actually planning another one this summer. So hopefully we can hit a couple more distilleries and interview a couple more executives there.
Yeah, I think it's incredible that you've gotten to do that and have those experiences. And it's a little bit different, but I know for Megan and myself, when we travel, one of our favorite things to do is check out different breweries. And we have that app, which is, I believe, called Untapped. And you can check in on the beers you're trying. And on a different level, it's been something cool for us to get into. And we found the same thing as we just travel and stop in at breweries, that people who work there are typically so receptive. And I think to your point, people in that industry, whether it's beer or whiskey or bourbon or what have you, are just open to talking about what they're doing and open to others. And I think it's so cool that you've been able to have that little crossover with the My Favorite Movie. Have you ever thought about talking to one day famous Hollywood directors or actors and actresses about their favorite whiskey?
Yeah, we'd love to do something like that. What we found is that the Hollywood community is a little bit less open and receptive than the whiskey community has been. But yeah, I mean, as the podcast builds, we would absolutely love to start bringing in more people from that industry. We've kind of found a nice little inroad so far of we've had a couple film critics on the podcast, and that's been really fun because we get to talk about what it's like being a critic, especially I think more and more as the internet has divided us and people really publicly disagree with critics. We've gotten to talk about what's the backlash like, what's the mindset of a critic, what's it look like when you really champion a movie after having to sit through 200 crap movies a year that the rest of us don't have to sit through. So it's been really fun. We're trying to find inroads into the film community to kind of balance those things out. And that's where we've seen the best response so far.
I do want to talk more about the movie side of what you guys do. But before we get into that, I don't remember if you've reviewed this on the pod or not, but recently for my birthday, I was gifted a bottle of Basil Hayden's that I really enjoyed. Have you reviewed Basil Hayden's, or what's your thoughts on that particular brand?
You know, it's really funny you bring that one up. Basil Hayden's was one of the first 4 whiskeys we ever did on the podcast. And so, when we tried it, I think we were at our newest and probably had the least amount of vocabulary to describe what we were drinking. But I remember that we both didn't really care for it. It's one of those whiskeys. I think it's made by the Jim Beam Company, and it's a semi top shelf whiskey. It probably costs $40 or $50 to get a good sized bottle of it. And it's only 80 proof, which is the lowest amount of alcohol you can legally have in a bourbon to call it bourbon. So what that means is when they took it out of the barrel, they water it down to the point where it's at the lowest possible point it can be and still legally be called bourbon. And when we drank it, we really found that it was really watery and it didn't have a lot of character to it. And that the other 3 whiskeys that we had tried during that day of recording were all better than it. And the fact was they were all cheaper too. So, everybody has their preferences. And I know a lot of people that really like Basil Hayden's just as kind of an easy sipper. And we tell people on the podcast, drink the whiskey that you like. We're not here to tell you what to drink and what not to drink. We're just giving you our opinions on what's in our glass. So if you really like Basil Hayden's, that's awesome. But what Brad and I try to do is say, hey, if you like Basil Hayden's at $40, why not try a bottle of this other thing that only costs $15 that we think is really, really similar? Because at the end of the day, we really don't want whiskey to hurt people in the pocket. We've had really good high-priced whiskeys that we would recommend. We think really are worth, plunking down $50 on the counter for. But there's other ones that it's I think it's pretty clear that they're just overcharging people for it. And when a consumer goes into the liquor store and sees, oh, Basil Hayden's is $45, that must mean it's really good. That's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I find myself thinking that way as a consumer in general, that the higher priced item must be more of the higher quality. And like we've discussed previously in this episode, just the ability to be able to tell folks, well, if you like this at $40, you might like this at $20, I think is really good. Occasionally, through my travels, I'll find myself in Kentucky, specifically Lexington, and I'm always trying to bring home something that I can't get anywhere else. Are there any specific whiskeys or bourbons made in Kentucky that maybe you can only purchase there or aren't available on a more nationwide distribution that you would recommend someone making the effort to go and pick up?
Yeah, there's quite a few actually. And, some of them are really high end and some of them aren't, but there's a few that we really enjoy that are kind of only Kentucky distribution and are really affordable. One of them that we had last year is called Very Old Barton. They have 4 different proof ranges that you can get. So depending on if you want a really easy sipper, you might want to pick up the 80 proof, but they go all the way up to 100 proof. And those bottles generally run anywhere between $10 and like $15. It's a really, really affordable whiskey. And we've found that the 86, the 90, and the 100 proof are all incredible. There's also one that we pick up down there a lot called Heaven Hill Green Label. And that's only sold in Kentucky. That bottle I just picked up a couple months ago down there, and it cost me $15. So what we try to do is, if you want to go to Kentucky and get a whiskey that's only going to be produced in Kentucky that you bring back as a souvenir that's $80, $90, I can absolutely recommend those to you. But I also think it's really fun to be able to go down to Kentucky and get, 6, 8 bottles of Heaven Hill Green Label for $100 or whatever and bring it home. And then you have Christmas presents for everybody in your family. And you're like, I'm able to recommend it because it's a good quality whiskey, especially at the price. And even though it's only a $15 bottle of whiskey, you factor in the fact that you'd have to travel all the way to Kentucky to get it. And it actually is a way more valuable bottle than what you pay for it.
Yeah, for sure. Just out of curiosity, what is your personal favorite whiskey?
Oh man, that's really hard. We've had a lot of whiskeys on the podcast. Brad and I were both kind of new to Scotch when we first started, and we found that there's a couple different varieties of Scotch. They're not all that really heavily smoky, peaty flavor. And we found this one called Glenmorangie Quinta Reuben, which is the Glenmorangie Scotch, and then it's aged in, I think, port barrels, or like finished in port barrels, and so it gives it this kind of really nice, like dark wine character. That's the highest rated one we've ever done on the podcast. My personal favorite is probably bourbon, and if I'm going to recommend any bourbon, there's one called Old Forester 1920. It's about $59 a bottle, so it is a pricier bottle of whiskey, but it's also like really high proof. It's 115 proof, so you're not going to go through it really quickly. And it is just the most delicious, smooth, dark, rich, complex whiskey I've ever had. So if you're looking to buy kind of a gift bottle, either for yourself or for someone special, Old Forester 1920, you cannot go wrong with that bottle.
Well, that is some really great information. I'm going to be referring back to this episode quite a bit for these recommendations for when I travel and just in general. And I don't, it kind of reminds me as we're talking about bourbons and whiskeys, occasionally Megan and I were photographing a wedding in uptown Charlotte, and we stopped in with our couple that we were photographing at the Ivy Hotel, which is this just incredible, really swanky hotel in uptown, and they have a New York, London style cocktail lounge in the hotel itself. And we're up there and we're getting ready to order a drink. And I think we ended up going with some variation that like their spin on an old fashioned. What do you think there's any credence to being able to judge the quality of a cocktail lounge or bar based on the quality of their old fashioned? Because that's kind of how we think of it. Like if you can make a really good old fashioned, it's probably a quality place.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. What I've found over the last year in talking with a lot of people in the whiskey community is that people will swear up and down that the whiskey that you use as your base or as your mixer makes all the difference. I was listening to a podcast a couple weeks ago where guys were arguing about what bourbon makes the best bourbon and Coke. And it's like, I never even would have thought of that before a year ago. But different whiskeys bring out different things, and when you pair it with a Coca-Cola, the sort of like marriage of those two things, it brings out completely different flavors if you're looking for it. So yeah, I think a lot of it is, can they make a good old fashioned, but also what kind of whiskey are they using? Are they just using the cheapest possible thing in their bourbon, or are they going to give you something that they think really actually brings out all the flavors of all the ingredients in that cocktail?
That is a great way to think of it that I hadn't considered before, of just thinking through what is the base bourbon or whiskey that's being used in a cocktail really affecting the quality. I know that sounds maybe kind of obvious or simplistic, but I'm someone that in the past I'll go to a cocktail lounge or somewhere and I'll order a drink and just kind of accept what is given. And I've started in more recent years to think through being more picky about the base and what's in it and how that affects the quality. So those are some really good points. I want to transition in our conversation to talking more about movies. And one of the questions that I had for you is kind of about the 3 favorite films. And I know it's hard to kind of pick and choose between movies or things that you enjoy in the film industry, movies that you've reviewed that you really love. But what are some of the films that you've reviewed that are your favorites? Maybe give me like 3 or 4 of the ones that you've talked about on the podcast that you really enjoy. And I'd love to just kind of chat with you briefly about each one. I don't want you to give away content from your podcast, but maybe just talk briefly about why it is that you enjoy each of those 3 movies, why you've reviewed them, why they're some of your favorites.
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, like, I feel really selfish talking about this because the list that Brad and I are using to work through on the podcast is a list that I just kind of made up. I just put a bunch of movies on the list of films that I thought we should talk about these at some point. I really want Brad to see these X number of movies. And some of them are films that I don't even really like, but I think are necessary for people to see to have a really good, kind of well-rounded base of movies in their kind of film education. So I'm kind of partial to most of the movies on the podcast, but a few of them that I've really enjoyed, especially in the recording process. My favorite movie of all time is Casablanca. I just think that it's a movie that never, ever gets old. It's the best script ever written. I've never been able to watch that movie and not find something new that entertains me, that makes me laugh, that surprises me. It seems like every single thing that happens in that movie is perfect. The acting's perfect. The dialogue is great. Every twist and turn that film takes, it's just like, it's so familiar to me now, and it delivers like every single time. So that would be number 1 for me. Have you ever seen Casablanca?
I've actually never seen it. Is that Cary Grant?
So it's Humphrey Bogart.
Humphrey Bogart. Do people often mix up Humphrey Bogart and Cary Grant, or is that just me?
It might just be you, Corey, but you know what? That's okay.
So what you're saying is I could quite easily fill the Brad role on the podcast in terms of explaining movies I haven't seen. But no, I haven't seen Casablanca. When did it come out, roughly? Yeah,
so that movie came out in 1942. So, I mean, it's really funny now because I always think, when I think of like the 40s, for some reason I still think that we're in like the 90s. And I'm like, oh, that was like 50 years ago. But no, that movie's, going on 70, 80 years old now. So it's like, I feel like we're getting farther and farther away from this era of classic movies. And I think that's what makes it even more important for people to see them because, I started watching movies like this when I was in high school, and I was never into black and white movies. I always thought that it's got to be super outdated. They probably talk funny. It just doesn't have the same kind of content that I respond to in movies nowadays. And I think the more you watch old movies, the more you realize, like, yes, they had some censorship. They weren't allowed to swear and things like that. But you realize that 80 years ago is not a very long time at all. And things were the same then as they are now. And you can watch a movie that's 80 years old and realize that, wow, it's actually never been done better than this since then. And I think once you start to make those emotional and personal connections with old movies, they don't seem old anymore. It just seems like you've opened up another section of the library that was never available to you before. And so you just expand from like, oh, I only watch these kind of movies to, wow, actually, I think I really do like all the books on that other shelf too. Maybe I'll read them as well. So it's been really fun to go back in time and watch these films that hold up 80 years later. I don't know how many of our movies that we're watching now that we can say the same thing for. Like, how many of those will we be watching in 80 years? I have no idea, but it's really cool to be able to go back and see a movie like Casablanca that still just comes across as perfect almost 80 years later.
Well, you bring up a really good point with that. And someone like myself who tries to be so attuned to our current pop culture era, there's so much content these days. I others have said it, and I believe it too, that we're in the platinum age of TV. So there's so much premium content, and there's so much fighting for your attention, and so it does feel sometimes like it takes a bit of an extra effort to go back and rewatch or watch for the first time some of those older movies. But you're 100% right that a lot of the filmmaking from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., really does hold up today. And you begin to understand as you go back and watch some of these why a movie like Casablanca is such a classic. For myself personally, not to lump these movies in with the Casablanca, but I know that I've been on a kick lately of going back and rewatching some of the movies from the 70s that maybe I had never seen before or had seen once, just to get a feel for that era since it was before I was born. Films like Rocky, The Godfather, Taxi Driver. Going back and watching those, you just see so much quality filmmaking, and they didn't maybe have the technological capabilities we do these days. I know there's famous stories about George Lucas going in with the prequel trilogy of Star Wars and wanting to utilize all this new technology, and people have argued that maybe there was a losing of the plot or quality or what made those original Star Wars movies so great, and a director putting such an emphasis on technology. But the point being with some of these older movies that while it may not look like our movies today, so much of the filmmaking and acting and directing and writing holds up, will last generations. And it's a good point you bring up about would people 50 years from now look on some of our movies the same way?
Yeah, and I want to point out one thing that you said a minute ago was like, I don't want to lump these movies in with a Casablanca. But Corey, like, that's kind of the point of our whole podcast is we don't ever want to make anything seem unapproachable. We don't ever want to take a movie and put it up on a pedestal and be like, nothing will ever touch this movie. Because just like with whiskey, when it comes to movies, it's like, watch what you like. And what we've really found is that there are some movies that I put a movie like The Aviator on the list because I thought it was a really good Scorsese movie. And we went in watching The Aviator thinking, oh, this will be like a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10. And watching it with a really critical lens, we both gave, I think we both gave that movie a 9.5 out of 10. And what we found is like, oh no, this movie is actually nearly flawless. And so it gives us the opportunity not just to talk about the movies that everyone knows are classics. It's not just, Citizen Kane and The Godfather, but to actually say, no, The Aviator is an almost perfect movie. Catch Me If You Can is an almost perfect movie. And people don't talk about these movies a lot because I think they hear this narrative that only certain movies can be called classics. But at the end of the day, if you have a really good reason for why you think a movie is a perfect movie, then your opinion is welcome. Like aside from Casablanca, I think my other favorite movie would be Jurassic Park. I think it's a perfect movie. And people don't talk about it enough as a classic or as a perfect movie, but I will fight to the death on that movie. I think it's just absolutely brilliant. And so we never want to say this movie is up on a pedestal and unapproachable, because then I think it takes the fun out of finding new things and advocating for other movies to be called classics.
Yeah. And, one might say that you've spent so much time thinking about if you could review movies that you didn't stop to think if you should.
Yeah. Listen,
sorry, I just had to get Jurassic Park quote in there. It's a great movie. I totally agree with you. I love that movie. Who doesn't love a shirtless Jeff Goldblum? But, the filmmaking in that, and it's a classic. It's a movie you see that is indelibly attached to your memory for your entire life. And I love your point about a movie doesn't have to be put on a pedestal and that everyone's opinions are welcome and that film criticism is for everybody. And it can be objective and subjective, and you can hold that tension between those two together and just talk about things that you love.
There's this episode of The Office where Jim and Pam are kind of fighting about something that's going on with Pam's parents, and they're watching a movie with Andy in the break room the whole time. And Andy thinks that they're reviewing the movie and that they're seeing these really crazy things like in the subtext where no one else is seeing them. And at the end of the episode, Andy's like, you know what? Maybe I don't have what it takes to be a film critic, but I could be an art critic. And he starts saying, that painting is bad. And that's his whole criticism. But the funny thing about that is all of us are movie critics. All of us are food critics. All of us are whiskey critics. When you walk out of a movie and you look at your friend and say, man, that movie sucked, you're a movie critic. And all it takes is really being able to say why you think the movie sucks and have really good points about it. I think deep down, all of us know what is a good movie. There's just certain movies that everyone sees and agrees this is a really good movie. That's why The Shawshank Redemption is the #1 movie on IMDb, because even if all of us don't think it's the best movie ever, I think everyone agrees it's a good movie. And so I think what we're trying to do with the podcast is just be able to say, hey, we're two normal people, but we have just as much to say as anybody else about this stuff, called film criticism or whiskey criticism. And we think you do too. And so that's why we always invite the audience to give feedback, to record a voicemail that we can play on the air, because everybody's opinion is valid. And what we found is that everybody is capable, if they try hard enough and if you give them an avenue to do it, to articulate why they think something is good or bad. And it's been really, really fun to see how our audience is engaging in this process as well.
100%. And I love that you've made it so accessible and open to your audience and have really encouraged people to hone their own sense of criticism, because you're right. We are all critics, whether we have that title or not. We all practice some form of criticism in our daily lives. So being able to articulate that and explain, why you love something or what you don't like about it, and just giving everyone those tools, or reminding everyone, empowering them that they have those tools and just helping them to access that is pretty incredible. What's another of your favorite movies that you've reviewed on the pod?
Well, just real quickly, I'll go through a couple. We did one this season on Do the Right Thing, the Spike Lee movie, which is like one of the most controversial movies ever. And we had a friend of ours come in and do the podcast with us. And it's one of my favorite movies because it's such a hard movie to watch, but it's such a necessary movie to watch. And it's a really entertaining film. But I think sometimes the podcast gives us an opportunity to explore issues in society and really give our thoughts on where we went wrong and what we hope we can do better. And Brad had never seen the movie, and I think kind of watching Brad wrestle with the themes of that movie and the ending, which is kind of ambiguous, watching him go through that was really great, because I think as a guy who's seen that movie 10 times, it's like it never gets old for me, because I think it's necessary to kind of remind myself that these issues of race still exist in the world. But being able to have that conversation with Brad as a guy who had just watched the movie and was still wrestling with his interpretation of it, that was a really great experience for me. And then honestly, the other favorites I have are when Brad and I are like super divided on a movie. The first time that really happened was our very first episode. We did Goodfellas. And I picked Goodfellas for the first episode because I thought that it would be a really easy segue into the podcast. Like, who doesn't love Goodfellas? Well, it turns out Brad doesn't love Goodfellas. I think he ended up giving the movie like an 8 or an 8.5, but he spent the whole episode complaining about how he didn't like it at all. And so we got off on a really weird foot because our first episode was like this pretty intense argument. And then over the course of last year, we've had a couple more like that. One of them is the original Star Wars, A New Hope, which I like, but I don't love. And it's Brad's favorite movie of all time. So he was mad at me just for not loving it as much as he did. But sometimes we hit on a movie, like a few weeks ago, we did Eternal Sunshine, and I think that movie is nearly perfect. I love that film. And Brad just couldn't tap into it. And he ended up giving it a 2 out of 10. And so it kind of brought our average score out to like a 5.5 or something. And people were freaking out on social media about it. Like, how can you possibly give this movie a 5.5? But when you see the breakdown of the scores, it's me giving it like, I don't know, a 9.5 and Brad giving it a 2. And so those are always really fun episodes because we really have to be able to defend our point of view because you can tell the other one is like ready to pounce. And then it also makes for really good audience engagement when we're really divided on a movie because then people have to take sides.
Yeah, and speaking of divisiveness in your movie opinions, I heard that that one of you really did not like Harry Potter. Was that you?
No, we both really, really like the Harry Potter films. I think we both gave the first one an 8 And then we just did the second one a few weeks ago, and I think we both gave that one a 7.5 out of 10. But I think we would all agree, like, the first two movies are good, but I don't know anyone that would say that they're the best in the series. So we're excited to get to the rest of the Harry Potter series. But no, we're both big Harry Potter fans.
Good. Yeah, because we might have had some divisiveness here on the Easter pod if you guys didn't like Harry Potter.
No, man, we grew up on that.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Some of the films you reviewed that I really love or love the episode was your Empire Strikes Back. I love Star Wars, but I think that people often point to Empire Strikes Back as holding up on its own or being the best or their favorite of the original trilogy, and I think I would echo that. And then The Lion King, the original, because who doesn't love a Disney classic that we grew up on, as traumatizing as that movie can be in parts.
Right.
And which, just as a side note, have you seen the remade version of it?
I haven't. I was going to get around to it. It was on my list of, like, I should see this before the year ends so I can, like, make a comment on it. But no one that I've talked to about it really enjoyed it that much. And the best I've heard is, yeah, it was okay. So it's just, I haven't gotten around to it yet. I'll probably watch it at some point. But why fix something that isn't broken? Like, the original is so good and it's still so satisfying that if I never get around to seeing this remake, I think I'll be okay.
Yeah, I'm with you. I did watch it because I probably represent Disney's target audience in the sense, in part, in that I'm someone like you that grew up on these films they're remaking, and so they, whether they're good or bad, they kind of automatically have sucked me into wanting to see what they do with them in present day. But I think some of the critique I heard of the newest Lion King that I would echo is just what made the original Lion King, the animated version, so good is the emotion that could come across on these animals' faces and how integral that was to the story. Like Simba and him processing his sadness on his face, and and you have actors like Jeremy Irons doing Scar, and you have these classic performances that are going to last for eternity in terms of their greatness. And so, yeah, to try and rebuild on that kind of seemed like, what's the point? I agree. And then the last one I was going to bring up is one of your most recent episodes, which was Django Unchained. You guys have done a lot of Tarantino, and I respect that. I think I've seen every Tarantino film to this point. He's one of my favorite directors, as he is for many people. And that's a whole other podcast to try and rank his movies, but Django Unchained is definitely up there for me, and you guys both gave that a pretty high score.
Yeah, I think it's probably his most underrated movie. I think of his more recent movies, people really like Inglourious Bastards, which is a movie that Brad and I are both kind of mixed on. And I think Django, it does everything for us that Inglourious Bastards didn't do. And for me, it's like right there with Pulp Fiction. I think it's just a brilliant, brilliant movie. But it's really fun to talk about Tarantino movies because for some reason, ever since Pulp Fiction, he just has like a hold on the culture, and people see his movies. Even if they don't go to the theater to see them, you can bet that they're going to watch them on digital or on Blu-ray. And so everyone has an opinion on their favorite Tarantino movie. So I think we've done 3 of his movies now, and we've gotten really, really good feedback on all of them. Because the people who were mad at us about Inglourious Bastards, like they let it be known. And like you said, everyone has their own personal ranking, and I think people are really passionate about his movies.
Yeah, and rumor has it that he's got one more in the tank and then he's going to quit, which I definitely hope, or retire, I should say, which I definitely hope isn't true.
Yeah, me too.
We definitely want some more Tarantino films in our lives. We're going to wrap it up here soon, but I did want to kind of get your take for a couple minutes on this year's Oscars. By the time this comes out, we'll be roughly about a month removed from the ceremonies, but I was able to watch the entire Oscars telecast this year and have my own thoughts on kind of the nominees and the winners and all that. But some of the notables were Hair Love winning for Best Animated Short Film, which I was really excited about. And you had Parasite winning Best Picture. You had Brad Pitt as a supporting actor winner for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is another Tarantino film. Shout out. You had Joaquin Phoenix winning Best Actor. You had Renee Zellweger for her portrayal of Judy Garland winning Best Actress, Laura Dern in Marriage Story for Best Supporting Actress, Toy Story 4 animated short, or not animated short, animated film. You had Bong Joon-ho winning Best Director. So of some of those bigger award categories, what did you think of who won? What did you think of who was nominated? Do you think there were people that maybe should have won in those categories? What was your take on the Oscars as a whole this year?
I think the most important takeaway is that, for the last few years, the Academy has been trying to really diversify its membership. And I think we're really starting to see the fruits of that. A foreign film had never won Best Picture before. Nothing in a foreign language had ever won Best Picture. And for Parasite to win Best Picture is a huge moment in the history of the Academy Awards. It was not my number one movie of the year. And people have asked me, are you okay with it winning? And I don't really know how to answer that question because it won. So what does it matter if I'm okay with it? But it's a really good movie. And I think the importance of it winning is that it really opens up a whole new world for the Oscars. I think we're going to start seeing more foreign films get nominated for Best Picture, and now they have a legitimate chance to win. I will say, though, that I think that Twitter and just kind of the culture of outrage has kind of ruined the Oscars for me for the last couple years, because it seems like as the Oscar campaigning season goes on, there's always a few movies that kind of seem to emerge as the front runner. And whenever a movie comes out as the front runner, you log on Twitter and everyone who's involved in reviewing movies is trashing that movie all of a sudden. And a lot of times it's a movie that has been really well reviewed. Like going into the Oscars this year, it seemed like the front runner was the movie 1917, which is a movie that everyone liked. I didn't hear any critics that really said there's anything negative to say about this movie. And really the only thing I heard was it just seems like the really safe choice, and it seems like the Oscar-y movie that would typically win. And so because of that, people didn't want it to win. And I think with instances like that, it just makes me roll my eyes, because it's like, look, if it's a good movie and everyone agrees that it's a good movie, then if it wins Best Picture, let's be okay with that. We found something that everyone can unite on, finally, in the most divisive era of human history. And so I think allowing ourselves to get caught up in this sort of outrage culture has really affected things like the Oscars. And at the end of the day, maybe I'm too simplistic about it, but I just enjoy watching good movies. I don't need every movie I see to have a historic impact. I'm really happy for what happened with Parasite, and I would highly recommend everyone sees it. But most of the movies that were nominated for Best Picture this year, I would have been okay with most of them winning, because at the end of the day, they were all pretty good movies. And I think what we're trying to do with our podcast is just say, hey, find a movie that you love, advocate for it, absolutely, but let's all be able to kind of come to the table together and unite around the fact that we love watching movies and we love what movies can do for us. And so I think the Oscars are at their best when they're championing that. And so hopefully over the next few years, as we start to see things change with the Oscars, we get back to finding movies that unite us and not just, people shouting into their own sort of echo chamber about what deserved to win versus what didn't deserve to win.
Well, I think this year, especially in the Best Picture category, was just a stacked year, especially when you look back on some other Oscar years with the nominees for Best Picture. So I'm with you in the sense that I think a lot of those movies, if they had won, I would have been okay with them winning. And I definitely appreciate the historical significance of something like a Parasite winning. I'm happy for it. I think it was good, and I think it's important that it won, but it's hard for me to comment much further because I haven't actually seen Parasite yet. But I think I know it's going to be on Hulu starting in April is what I saw, and I do appreciate about the Oscars, and one of the ways that I've found to engage with them that's been really helpful for me is making sure I spend the time to watch each Best Picture nominee if I get the chance before the telecast. I think I saw maybe half of them before the actual telecast this year. And something like a Parasite, that does win Best Picture, I think what that'll obviously do now for someone like myself and others is kind of propel you to want to dive into it and watch it more. And that's kind of the Oscar bump, if you will, that those
Yep.
films get from winning. But in general, I just think it was a really stacked year. I found myself being pretty happy with most of the nominees that won, but it was hard for me to get attached to some of the winners or to experience some of that dialogue you're talking about for myself, because when you haven't seen half the movies, it makes it a little bit difficult. But I've got Marriage Story queued up, Parasite, some of these that I haven't seen yet. Marriage Story is one that is just, Megan and I keep talking about like, oh, when are we going to watch Marriage Story? And it's such a heavy movie, and that going in about divorce and about this painful relationship that, there never feels like a right day. Life is so hard anyway. You kind of want to sit down and watch something and be entertained at the end of the day. So one of these days we'll get around to watching Marriage Story and just kind of powering through the emotional nature of it. But, by all accounts, each film this year just would have deserved to win Best Picture. And, I think there were a lot of great people in the categories this year. So it just had a couple quick things here as we kind of finish up our discussion. And again, I really do have to thank you for taking the time to chat with me. You are episode 3, which is exciting, and I think it's been a really good one. I've enjoyed our time chatting together. As I mentioned up top, you've been one of the people that was instrumental in helping me to start this podcast through your expertise and allowing me to lean on you for your advice. What are some tips maybe that you would give to someone out there wanting to start a podcast or just getting started?
I think the first couple things are, obviously you have to find something that you're passionate about, something that you can talk about for hours and hours and not get tired of. Because if you get tired of what you're talking about, then your audience is also going to get tired of what you're talking about. So it's finding a topic that excites you. And then I also think going along with that, it's finding something that is going to be kind of niche enough to not get swallowed up by all of the podcasts in, the iTunes directory. For us, having the whiskey angle, I think really is what made our podcast successful, because it was the whiskey community that latched on really early, that was super welcoming and that helped grow our numbers. And it seems really interesting that no one out there has thought to do a film and whiskey podcast, but I think we've only found maybe 1 or 2 other podcasts in the whole Apple directory that even touch on both of these topics. So somehow we landed on something that was really unique and that no one was doing. And the feedback we're getting from the whiskey community is like, it's really cool to hear both of these things paired up because no one else is doing it. So I would say, like, don't make it so narrow that no one wants to listen to it. Like, but for us, it's whiskey and movies. And we're somehow filling a need and a hole in the podcast universe right now that kind of makes us unique and gives us something that people aren't finding somewhere else. So aside from those 2 things, I think the number one thing is you have to stay consistent. If you're looking to put out a product, like a podcast, you have to be on a schedule. You have to deliver it on time. I think what I see with a lot of people who start podcasts is that they'll like record their first 3 episodes, they'll drop them all at once, and then they'll find that they don't have a schedule in mind. And so the next time they release an episode is 3 months later, and then there's 2 weeks, and then it's another 3 months. And so there's absolutely no consistency. The big thing for me and Brad was, look, we know these first couple episodes are probably going to be rough. We're new to this, but let's keep on a schedule. Let's keep getting them out every Monday on time, and keeping ourselves to that schedule really helped us grow quickly as hosts. And I think it also helped our audience kind of get on board early because they could hit subscribe and know that there would be a new episode waiting for them every single week. So you have to keep your audience in mind, and you have to be willing to consistently deliver something on time. And I think that was the number one key to us finding any success in the early going.
Yeah, that all makes perfect sense. I agree with it wholeheartedly. And I know for myself, I found my niche and starting a podcast about the holiday of Easter. I mean, we cover everything here. We cover Easter eggs, Easter baskets, Easter candy, the resurrection of Christ. We talk about it all in the Easter pod. So
the validity of pastel colors. Yeah, I get it, man.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you understand. And, there's no other podcast talking about Easter. So,
right.
Yeah, it worked out perfectly. But no, yeah, and in all seriousness, you're right. It's about that consistency and kind of pushing through all the the fumbling around with it and learning how to do stuff and being new to it. And then, finding something, whether it's, personality based or based on around a specific topic or whatever, that is just kind of a through line through the podcast, having that purpose. I think that's all really important. I agree. One last question I had here. What are a couple of the podcasts that you really enjoy just personally, whether they're about movies or whiskey or anything?
I think in the early going, if you are a listener of podcasts and you're making a podcast, you're probably just going to be shamelessly stealing stuff and aping other podcasts. And that's what we did. The one that really sparked us to start this podcast is called Unspooled. It has the comedian Paul Scheer and the film critic Amy Nicholson, and they're going through the American Film Institute's top 100 films one by one and kind of talking about, do these deserve to still be considered the 100 most important films? It's really entertaining. And Paul Scheer, the comedian, he's seen a lot of movies, but he hasn't seen every movie on this list. And I think seeing a kind of a celebrity that you would think would have seen all these movies kind of be open and vulnerable and say, no, I've never seen this, and here's my honest thoughts. That's kind of what put us over the edge in terms of like really pulling the trigger on this podcast and saying like, nope, we can do this. This, like, we see what they're doing and our dynamic is pretty similar. And so let's give it a try. So that one was really influential in terms of getting us started. I also like to listen to, some of these really major movie podcasts. There's one called Film Spotting that's two critics talking about new films that come out. There's a great one called The Rewatchables, which is on the Ringer Network. That one's really laid back, and that's kind of given us a lot of ideas for some of our segments that we try to keep lighthearted, because they have a whole thing that they go through certain categories where they like give out these ridiculous awards to obscure actors in the movie and things like that. That's a really fun podcast. So all of those podcasts put together have kind of helped us find our voice and find our identity. And, in a lot of ways, you kind of have to take what they're doing and try to make it your own. And for a while, if you're a Bill Simmons fan, your podcast is probably going to sound like Bill Simmons until you learn what your own voice sounds like. So the ones that we listen to, you can hear the influence in our podcast, but hopefully we're doing a good enough job that we're not going to get sued for stealing anybody's IP. So that's our goal.
To not get sued is a great goal. Yeah, I think you actually turned me on to Unspooled, and I think I introduced you to The Rewatchables. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm a huge fan of the Ringer Network and The Rewatchables and Bill Simmons and Sean Fennessy, Chris Ryan, all their podcasts. All their stuff has been a huge inspiration to me in starting this. So, those are all some great podcasts you mentioned. How do people listen to the Film and Whiskey podcast? Do you have anything coming up you want to promote? Like, talk to us about where we can find you.
Yeah, you should be able to find us on every major podcast platform. I mean, unless you're listening to like some obscure Russian database that I'm not familiar with. Like, we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Spotify, we're on Google Podcasts, we're on Blueberry and Stitcher and Tuned In and iHeart. You can find us anywhere. It's Film and Whiskey with the little ampersand thing. So if you just type in Film Whiskey into a search bar, you should be able to find us really easily. We do have a bonus episode coming out this Thursday, March 5th, where we're interviewing a woman named Peggy No Stevens. She is a legend in the bourbon industry. She's in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. She has been like instrumental in launching the sort of bourbon tourism industry. And she also worked for a number of years as a master taster for Woodford Reserve and some of those brands. So she just has a ton of experience. She has a new book coming out where she walks people through how to do a whiskey tasting or how to host like a cocktail party. And it's really, really informative. The book is called Which Fork Do I Use With My Bourbon? And honestly, they sent us a review copy to look at before the interview. And I learned so much just about nosing, tasting, presenting whiskey. So if getting into drinking whiskey or some other spirit is something that you're interested in, I would check out this episode that we have coming out this week. It's really informative, and I think it's a fun conversation.
How about if they want to follow you on social media?
Yeah, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Film Whiskey. We use Instagram the most. We have a really, really good committed follower base on Instagram. So you can follow us on any of those platforms, or if you listen to our podcast and you want to give us some feedback, we do have a call-in line, and I'll give the number to that real quick. It's 216-800 5923. And we love engaging with people's voicemails and playing them on air. So yeah, if you watch any of the films that we review and you want to give some feedback, give us a call.
Well, Bob, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. I know we've gone well over the time we had kind of allotted, but I just really enjoyed the conversation with you and the discussion about all things film and whiskey. And, you know, like I mentioned up top, we are lifelong friends. We've known each other since middle school, I believe. So it's always good, especially since moving, to be able to reconnect. And, you know, we'll have to have you on again sometime, or maybe if you guys are so bold, you'd have me review a film or some whiskey with you and Brad on the pod sometime. But we'll definitely have to chat again and do this soon. There's so much more to talk about. I think we just only scratched the surface. But thank you again so much for coming on the Easter Pod.
Thanks so much for having me, Corey.
It's my pleasure, Bob. Now go enjoy a nice film and some whiskey.
All right, will do.